My mother once looked me straight in the eye and said, "You were never really my daughter." I remember the way she said it calmly, as if it were just another fact in a list of things that didn't matter anymore. That sentence never left me. It hovered over every holiday I didn't come home for, every voicemail I ignored, and every night I stared at the ceiling, wondering what kind of person I had become. Now, 10 years later, I was back in their house, back in that oversized, cold dining room that had more silence than memories. Officially, it was supposed to be a family dinner, a reunion. That's what the email had said. One sentence, no punctuation. "We're having dinner Sunday." No apology, no warmth. Still I went. Curiosity is dangerous like that. I arrived 15 minutes early and waited in the driveway for another 10. The house looked the same. Clean lines, perfect hedges, a front door that was always locked from the inside even when someone was home. My mother answered it like I was a package that had been delivered to the wrong address. She stepped aside without a word. My father barely looked up from his seat at the head of the table. The place was set for 4, but only 3 people would sit. That empty chair was the first sign that someone remembered I existed. I sat across from my father, directly under the chandelier I used to stare at when I was grounded. I didn't speak. They didn't either. The food came out in courses like we were playing restaurant. My mother served lamb, my father's favourite, even though I hadn't eaten meat in years. I didn't say anything. I wasn't here to be heard. I was here to see what they wanted. Halfway through the second course, my mother opened a bottle of wine. A deep, red, almost black. She poured it into crystal glasses, ones I'd never seen before. She handed me mine without making eye contact. "It's the good stuff," she said. "From your father's cellar." I held the glass in my hand, watched how the light passed through it like blood under a microscope. I took a sip. Nothing burned, but the aftertaste fell off. Maybe it was the air, or maybe it was them. Something wasn't right. My father cleared his throat. "We wanted to talk to you about something," he began. His voice was smoother than I remembered, less commanding, more careful. That was the second sign. "It's just a document," my mother added. "Nothing complicated. Some liability paperwork from the company. We need someone neutral to sign it. Just for a few weeks." She slid a folder across the table. I didn't touch it. I looked at the gold-embossed crest on the cover. Quinn Defense Industries. My last name was printed below it as if I still belonged to them. "Why me?" I asked. My father smiled like he'd prepared for that question. "You're clean. No ties. You haven't been involved with the business in over a decade. You're the perfect proxy. Proxy. That's what I was to them now. A convenient blank space on a legal form." I leaned back and looked at both of them. Their clothes were neat, faces unreadable, but the room smelled like effort, like something rehearsed. I picked up the wine. Again, sipped slower this time. My throat felt dry. "Julian couldn't sign it?" I asked. I already knew the answer. My brother had always been the golden one, the future of the company. He could do no wrong. I, on the other hand, had been the problem, the rebel, the mistake. My father hesitated. "Julian has obligations. It's just better this way." I looked down at the folder, then back at them. Their eyes softened like they were trying to remember how to act like parents. "We trust you," my mother said. That was the third sign. They never used to trust me with the TV remote, let alone a corporate liability form. Something was wrong. Something deeper than the food, or the wine, or the forced small talk. I didn't open the folder. I didn't need to. I'd been trained to read silence better than any contract. The meal dragged on. They asked me questions in that way people do when they're trying to collect data, not connect. I answered in short sentences, didn't offer details. My mother kept refilling my wine even when I hadn't finished the glass. My father watched my face more than he watched his plate. The chandelier above us flickered once, then steadied. No one mentioned it. By dessert, the room had cooled. My mother brought out creme brulee. I used to love it. I didn't touch mine. The wine had started to make me feel sleepy, but not drunk. Like my limbs were a few seconds behind my brain. That's when I knew. Whatever they had put in the wine, it wasn't meant to kill me. Just disarm me, make me slow, compliant. So, what happens if I say no? I asked. My father looked at me the way he used to look at his employees when they asked for too much. Why would you? We're family. That word, family, it's always used like a net, something they throw over you to keep you from running. I stood up, slowly. My mother blinked fast like she hadn't prepared for that. I'm not signing anything, I said, and you're right. I'm the perfect proxy because I've never really belonged here. I left the folder on the table untouched. My chair scraped against the floor sharp and final. My footsteps echoed through the hallway, past the photos that never included me, the walls that never absorbed my voice. As I reached the door, I looked back once, not out of nostalgia, but calculation. They were frozen, not afraid, not angry, just confused, like they couldn't figure out when they lost control. But I knew. They never had it. Not really. Not over me. Not anymore. They think I'm still the 16-year-old they kicked out with a trash bag and a warning. They don't know I learned to disappear in a different way. They don't know who I really am. But to understand that, to understand how someone like me becomes invisible in plain sight, you'd have to go back not just to last week or last year, but all the way back to the slow erasure that started long before I even knew I was being erased. My family didn't hate me. That would have been easier. They simply forgot to notice me, forgot to see me as someone with shape and colour. Julian was always in focus. He was born glowing. Blonde hair, loud laugh hands that waved too much when he talked. He was the kind of boy people stopped to admire. Such charisma, the teachers would say. What a future. I once won first place in a statewide science competition. I'd built a working model of an earthquake simulator. I came home holding the plaque in both hands, dirt still under my nails from the last-minute adjustments I made with toothpicks and borrowed wires. My mother glanced at it, smiled faintly, and said, "Don't brag to Julian. He has a lot going on right now." That same week, Julian made the B team for his soccer squad. There was a cake balloons and a new pair of cleats waiting for him at dinner. My birthday came a month later. No one mentioned it. No card, no candle, just leftovers and a missing seat at the table. I told myself they forgot. I told myself they were busy. I told myself everything, but the truth I didn't matter enough. There was a time I believed I could earn it. That love, attention, even fairness was something you could work toward. I studied harder. I cleaned without being asked. I did the things they praised Julian for, and I did them better. But it didn't change anything. He failed a math class and blamed the teacher. My parents scheduled a meeting and got the teacher removed from the department. I once got a 98 and was asked, "Why not $100?" Julian got caught plagiarizing a paper in high school. The school hushed it. My father made a call. "Boys will be boys," he said. I got suspended once for pushing a boy who tried to touch me without permission. No one made a call for me. Just a scolding and a 2-week silence from my mother. I started to understand. There were rules for me and none for him. Julian was the legacy. I was the liability. I remember a day when I was 8. We were told to draw what we wanted to be when we grew up. I spent 2 hours sketching a map of the world, labelling every country, adding little symbols, where I wanted to travel cameras, for places I wanted to photograph stars, for places I wanted to study. I brought it home and taped it on the wall in the hallway. That same night, Julian drew a tank with stick figures and explosions. My father framed it. The next morning, my map was gone. I found it in the trash folded under a pizza box. My mother told me it was too messy for the hallway. We need to keep things neat when guests come. Julian's tank remained on display for years. These memories aren't meant to be dramatic. They're not wounds I pick at. They're files I've archived, studied, used to understand the patterns. Because that's what I do now. I look for patterns. And this pattern was simple. Julian shines. Mila disappears. Even when I won a full ride to one of the top universities, they told me not to post it. We don't want Julian to feel overshadowed, my father said. He's going through a lot right now. He was reapplying to a business program he had been waitlisted from. They didn't want my light to remind him of his dimness. I told myself to be the bigger person. That was the lie I used to feed the silence. I stopped talking about school. I stopped bringing home awards. I learned to disappear before they could erase me. The irony, of course, is that I ended up disappearing into the exact space they thought I was too weak to survive. The shadows, the sidelines, the place where people don't look twice. And in that invisibility, I learned everything I needed. I learned how to watch, how to record, how to read the way people move when they're lying. That's what the years gave me. Not a family, but training. And even now, sitting in this car outside their house, hours after that wine-soaked dinner and the not-so-subtle blackmail, I can still hear my mother's voice. You were never really my daughter. Maybe she was right. Maybe daughters don't survive in homes like these. Maybe you have to become something else. Something quieter, sharper. And in that transformation, I stopped being their child. I became their reckoning. I didn't know the specifics yet, but I knew something had cracked open under their careful, cold surface. The way my father hesitated when I declined the wine, the way my mother pushed that folder toward me with a smile too sweet to trust. They weren't asking, they were orchestrating. The next morning, a file arrived in my inbox from an anonymous account. 32 pages long. I read every line. Julian had accepted bribes from a foreign weapons supplier, unregistered and under-the-table deals. Tens of millions filtered through shell corporations, contracts cloaked under fake consulting agreements. He wasn't even discreet. It was lazy corruption, the kind people only attempt when they believe someone else will clean up the mess. And they always did. My parents had spent a lifetime making sure Julian never touched the consequences of his actions. I met them later that afternoon in a private room at a golf club they frequented when they needed to look respectable. White linens, dim lights, 2 glasses already filled. I didn't touch mine. Julian's in trouble, my father began. My mother slid a photo across the table, Julian in a hospital bed, pale and unconscious. His heart, she said. He's not strong. Prison would kill him. I stared at the image, then back at her. You used this in the Christmas card 5 years ago. Her mouth opened, closed. My father picked up where she faltered. We need a name on record, just temporarily. We'll fix it once the pressure eases. You want me to take the fall, I said. You're the only one not attached to the company my mother offered. That's what makes you perfect. I didn't respond. I watched their faces shift from false concern to mild impatience. I could feel it in their tone. This wasn't a request. This was stage 2 of the plan. When I didn't answer, they started to stack on guilt. Julian couldn't handle a trial, my father said. He's not built for it. He's your brother, my mother added softer now. And you're our daughter. Am I said. That's new. My voice didn't rise. I didn't accuse. I simply reached into my bag and placed a manila folder on the table. Inside were printed copies of every transaction time-stamped and sourced. I slid it next to their hospital photo like a second course. I know what he did. I know how long it's been happening. And I know you both helped cover it. My mother flinched. My father clenched his jaw. "You've been spying on your own family. I've been paying attention," I said. "There's a difference." I stood. "I won't be your insurance policy." As I turned to leave, my father's voice came low and sharp. "You think this protects you? You think they'll back you over their oldest client?" I paused. "I don't need protection. I have proof." Outside, the sky had gone grey. I didn't have a destination. I just walked. That evening, as I checked into a cheap hotel under a different name, my phone buzzed. A message from a hidden number. "You're the only one who can save this family." It was Julian. I stared at it for a long time. The words weren't surprising. What was surprising was how flat they felt. Not cruel, not emotional. Just a transaction. A belief that I still saw myself as someone obligated to clean up after them. I turned off the phone, slept in my clothes. At 2 a.m, I woke up and logged into a server I hadn't touched in years, my backup archive. Encrypted files, audio logs, employee records, company contracts. I hadn't built it to destroy them. I built it to survive them. I divided the data into 3 sets. Julian's contracts, internal memos, and recordings of private meetings. I uploaded a copy to a secure vault. Sent another to someone I trusted, just in case. The next day, my hotel room was broken into. Nothing stolen, just touched. A toothbrush moved, a drawer half open, a message. I didn't report it. I just left. Switched hotels. Burned the SIM. I didn't have fear anymore, just resolve. Because this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about anger. It was about accountability. About all the people their money had buried. People like Erin, the compliance officer, who disappeared after flagging the same red flags I had now. I remembered the way they spoke about her unstable, too emotional, not a team player. The file on her disappearance was thin. But I kept it. I always kept the things they threw away. That night, I opened a blank document. Typed a single sentence. They moved first. The reckoning had started. I didn't sleep. I walked the empty streets of a city I barely knew, the soles of my boots echoing on cracked pavement. The air tasted like metal, like rain that never fell. There was a part of me, deep buried, that wanted to cry. Not because I was afraid, but because even now, after everything, I still felt the outline of what I used to want. A family, a place, a seat at the table that wasn't conditional. I kicked a piece of gravel into the road and watched it disappear beneath passing headlights. I didn't belong to them. I never had. The next morning, the smear campaign began. It started with a leaked report in a minor outlet accusing me of mishandling proprietary defence data during my time at Quinn Defence. The article was vague, but pointed just enough to catch attention, just enough to trigger doubt. By noon, 3 more sites had picked up the story. By evening, there was an anonymous source quoted in a major defence blog. She was always a little unstable, brilliant, but difficult, paranoid. They used my silence as evidence of guilt. They spun my absence into proof of wrongdoing. I turned off all alerts. I stopped checking my name. But the damage moved fast. A friend from college, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, called me. "Mila," she said, low and urgent. "They're saying you falsified contracts, that you had offshore accounts." I didn't reply. "Listen," she said, "a friend of mine works at DOJ. Off the record there's chatter. They're building something. A formal indictment. You need to disappear." I thanked her and hung up. Then I turned on a burner phone I hadn't touched in 5 years. 1 number, 1 call. It rang twice. "Took you long enough," a voice said. "Alex, my old handler." "They're closing in," I said. "They think I'm just a rogue employee. They don't know who I really am." "Not yet," he said. "Are you still clean?" "Always." Silence. Then, "You want extraction?" "No," I said. "I'm staying. I'm finishing this." The line went dead. I tucked the phone away and pulled out a different file. a clean record of the last 5 years. Every shift, every meeting, every document I accessed while working inside Quinn Defence. I wasn't just an analyst. I wasn't just someone with a name on payroll. I was placed there by the agency as part of an ongoing surveillance program. They wanted to monitor the growing connection between Quinn Defence and unstable foreign clients. I was the quiet one, the forgettable one. They saw that as weakness. It was design. I never fought to be seen. I fought to stay in the room. And in that room, I listened. I copied files. I recorded conversations. I watched Julian fumble deals and watched my father clean them up. I watched my mother pretend not to notice. But it wasn't just them. It was everyone around them. Corrupt CFOs, lobbyists laundering influence, government liaisons looking the other way. I had names, timestamps, payment trails, and I'd kept it quiet until now. There had been a time I considered walking away. After Derek died, I nearly did. He was my contact inside. A double cover. We worked 2 floors apart for almost 3 years, communicating only through coded notes left in shared drives. He was the only one who understood how deeply embedded I had become, the only one who knew how much I had given up. Then, one day, he was gone. Cardiac arrest, they said. Stress-related. But I knew better. He had access to something too dangerous to keep. They said he left no notes. They were wrong. He left everything to me. A USB drive hidden in a hollowed-out pen, tucked in the back of a drawer we both shared during overlapping shifts. It had all the early drafts of the offshore transfer contracts, documents Julian wasn't supposed to see, let alone sign. That was the day I stopped pretending this was just another assignment. That was the day I started preparing for war. So when my parents tried to frame me, I wasn't surprised. I was ready. I had always been ready. They thought I was a shadow, but shadows remember light. And I remembered everything. I opened a new document on the secure drive. Not a file dump. Not another report. A letter. One I would send when the time came. One that would explain everything. But not just to the agency. To the world. To every person who had been told to sit down, stay quiet, make room for someone else. I wasn't going to make room anymore. I was going to take mine back. That thought didn't come from anger. It came from training. There's a place in Virginia no one talks about in polite conversation. It doesn't exist on maps. You don't get invited, you're selected. They call it the farm. That's where I disappeared before I ever reappeared in my father's company. It's not glamorous. No explosions, no car chases. Just dirt, sweat, and the kind of silence that teaches you what your mind sounds like when it's stripped of everything else. You don't know when the training begins. One morning, you're there the next. You're no longer yourself. They break you early, not with violence, but with control. No clocks, no sleep schedule, just darkness and orders. You learn to breathe through panic and call it normal. They taught us to read people faster than people knew they were being seen, to memorize maps after a single glance, to see patterns in chaos. But the most important lesson came in pain, not in how to resist it, but in how to use it. At the farm, they teach you to dissect emotion like a mechanic strips an engine carefully, deliberately, without mercy. Pain becomes information. Anger becomes a lever. I remember the night I learned how far I could go. They called it verification. You were blindfolded, tied down, and interrogated by someone from your own unit. Mine was Derek. He asked the same 3 questions over and over. Where are you from? Who trained you? What's your name? I lied with confidence. That was the test, not to hold out, but to protect the truth without blinking. What I didn't expect was the way he pressed on the real things. My father's name, my brother's scandals, my own academic record. That's when I realised how deeply they'd studied me. I didn't flinch, not for 8 hours. When it ended, Derek untied me and said, "You're one of us now." It wasn't praise, it was confirmation. The farm doesn't cry, and neither did I. But that didn't mean I didn't feel it. Every morning, at 4:00 a.m, we ran 5 miles in silence. They'd place a glove or a wallet along the route, sometimes nothing at all, and later they'd ask what we saw. Most people failed the first time, not because they were weak, but because they hadn't yet learned how to see without staring. We did drills where they starved us for 48 hours, then made us assemble weapons blindfolded. We practiced how to fall asleep upright, how to fake a panic attack, how to forget who we were. But I never forgot. I stored it all. The map of my home, the feel of my father's voice when he lied, the way Julian's jaw tightened when he got caught. I carried it like equipment, like armour. It was that discipline, not hatred, that kept me quiet for so many years. People thought I was passive, compliant, but I was in position, waiting. And when the agency gave me the assignment, embedded surveillance inside Quinn Defence, I said yes without hesitation. I was the forgotten daughter. No one looked twice, that was the point. I filed contracts, fetched coffee, listened. They thought I was dead weight. But I was watching. I had access they didn't even monitor. Because why would they? I was Mila, the girl they erased. But the truth is, I was never just Mila. I was an operative, embedded, cleared, trained. For 5 years, I gathered data, recorded meetings, photographed documents, shadowed key personnel, and no one suspected a thing. Only Derek knew the full picture. He was embedded too under a different identity. We passed notes through shared drives coded as admin bugs. He was smart. Too smart. That's probably why they took him out. Cardiac arrest, they said. But I knew his routine, knew how careful he was. When I found the pen in our old desk, a cheap plastic thing with a metal core, I knew. Inside was a USB. It held the first versions of Julian's illegal contracts. Dated, watermarked, real. After Derek, I wanted out. My handler said no. You're too close to the core. We can't replace you. So I stayed, smiling, serving coffee, pretending to care. I played the role until it became second skin, but I never stopped watching, never stopped collecting. And now I wasn't just a witness. I was the one person who knew where everybody was buried figuratively, and maybe not. I stood in front of the mirror in that cheap motel bathroom and didn't see a victim. I saw a weapon. They thought I'd go quietly, that I'd be the same girl who gave up her graduation speech because my father said Julian needed the stage. I walked off that stage without a word, handed him my speech, and smiled for the cameras. That was the last time I let them decide who deserved to be seen. Now, I was done disappearing. The farm teaches you there's no such thing as too much silence, only the wrong kind. I'd waited long enough. It was time to speak with proof. That was the thought running through my head as I stepped through the gate of my childhood home again. It was all too familiar, the echo of heels against polished tile, the faint scent of something expensive simmering in the kitchen. Everything staged to appear perfect. And yet, the moment I sat down at the long mahogany table, I knew something was off. The air was too still, the wine too dark. My father smiled like a man who had just won something, not like someone welcoming his daughter home. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she poured the glass. "To starting over," she said. The toast was hollow. I watched the wine catch the chandelier light. It shimmered wrong, too thick, with a reddish hue I'd never seen in a Pinot. I didn't drink it, not at first. I waited, let them think I trusted them. Then a small sip, metallic, off, not immediate, but wrong. A few minutes later, my throat tightened. My limbs grew heavy. The room tilted. They spoke to me, but their voices blurred, muffled like underwater echoes. My father stood. He wasn't rushing to help. He was waiting. I tried to stand, but collapsed to the floor, the chair crashing behind me. My mother let out a small startled cry, not fear, more like surprise that it worked. The last thing I heard before losing consciousness was her voice saying, "It had to be done." When I came to it was cold, damp. My head throbbed like it had been hit with a hammer, but there were no bruises, just an ache. I was lying on concrete. It smelled of dust mould and cork. The wine cellar. I tried to sit up. My wrists were bruised but not bound. My clothes were the same, but my shoes were gone. They hadn't buried me. They hadn't even bothered to finish the job. I looked around slowly. Stale boxes, glass racks, one security light buzzing overhead. It flickered. That's when I noticed it, blinking just barely behind a shelf of 1998 Bordeaux. A camera, small, embedded into the wall, angled down toward where I'd been left. Not old, not dust-covered, active, recording. They weren't going to bury me. They were going to record my suicide. I moved carefully toward the lens. It didn't react. It was hidden behind tinted glass tucked into the architecture. I followed the wire back to a black conduit leading upstairs. Probably to my father's private office where all surveillance feeds went. I knew the system. I'd helped install it when I was 17. The house upgrade, he'd called it. I stood. My legs wobbled, but held. Whatever they dosed me with had short-term effects. Mild sedative, maybe something untraceable? Enough to disorient, not kill. Not directly. I reached for the nearest bottle, heavy glass, still corked, and smashed it against the floor. Red wine pooled like blood, but I didn't stop. I used the jagged neck as a blade. Not to harm. To pry open the side panel of the wine rack. Behind it, the emergency fuse box. The one the builders had hidden during renovations, which only I remembered. I flipped the breaker for Garage East then, Office North. Cameras cut. Lights snapped off. Silence returned. I counted to 20. Waited. Nothing. No alarms. No voices. Then footsteps. Upstairs. Fast. Not panicked. Methodical. My father. Probably checking the feed. I moved fast. Grabbed a flashlight from the supply crate and slid through the wine rack's rear crawl space, an old vent tunnel that led to the back patio. I'd used it as a child to sneak out. Now I used it to escape a murder scene staged to look like self-destruction. I emerged covered in dust, my hands bleeding from broken tile, but alive. I made it across the lawn into the hedges out the gate. No one saw me. No one followed. They thought I was unconscious. They thought I'd go quietly. Again. That was their mistake. I didn't go to the police. Not yet. I went to the safe house. Old CIA property, 10 miles out off-grid, marked in files only people like me would know how to find. There, I showered, cleaned the cuts, changed clothes, uploaded a copy of the cellar footage to my private server. I watched it. Watched myself slump. Watched them not help. My father checked my pulse. Then turned to the camera, nodded and walked out. My mother wiped her tears with a monogrammed napkin. Then the lights dimmed. Scene over. It was all a production, not sloppy, not rushed, practiced. I stared at the screen, not crying, just watching, letting the silence settle. This time it wasn't mine. It was theirs, and I was done protecting it. The clip was still in my hair, tucked behind my right ear. It looked like nothing cheap metal scratched enamel, the kind of thing you'd throw in a drawer and forget. But at the farm, they taught us how the smallest tool could open the biggest doors. I slipped it free, worked it into the base of the wine cellar's service latch and twisted. Click. The door gave way just enough to let me slide out my body, still sluggish from the drug, but adrenaline keeping me upright. I didn't look back. Outside, the air was colder than it should have been. I moved fast, tracing the garden path that curved behind the house just out of view of the kitchen windows. I paused near the stone fountain, reached under the lip of the marble basin, and pulled out the small cash I'd hidden as a teenager. A burner phone, old ID, and a prepaid Metro pass wrapped in a plastic pouch. It was still there. I had always assumed I'd need to run. I was on foot for the first hour, moving through alleyways and service roads until I reached the abandoned transit lot off Harris Avenue. There, I stole a rusting delivery bike, dumped my coat, and blended into the early morning workers. A woman in a visor handed me coffee without asking questions. I nodded, took it, and disappeared into the crowd. That's when the messages started. My old secure line, long dormant, lit up. Strings of numbers, coordinates, a name I hadn't heard in years. Omar. I made my way to the meeting point, an old strip mall, half-shuttered, a cracked neon sign above what used to be a laundromat. I entered through the side. There he was. Taller now, broader, a hoodie pulled low, but the eyes were unmistakable, sharp, still cautious. "You look like hell," he said. I managed a smile. "You grew up?" He shrugged. Didn't have much choice. He handed me a hard drive. Everything they tried to erase I pulled back. Logs deleted security footage access points. They were sloppy, overconfident. He led me to a back room filled with monitors. Footage looped on screen to the wine cellar, the fake timestamp the cleanup crew entering 30 minutes after I passed out. Another feed showed my father making a call. The voice was muffled, but Omar enhanced it. Proceed with the mental instability narrative. Push it hard. If she resurfaces, make it look like a delusion. Use the hospital file from '09. That should be enough. My breath caught. I hadn't thought about 2009 in years. The psych eval they forced on me after I refused to transfer colleges for Julian's convenience. It was all connected. "Check this too," Omar said, pulling up a chain of DNA test results. They planted a fake identity on. You constructed a profile using false mental health markers, even staged a blood sample for a death certificate draft. It's like they were prepping to kill you for real if the wine didn't do it. I sat down. "Hard." "And Julian?" I asked. He nodded toward another screen. "He was there. The system shows him deactivating the alarm that night. But here's the part they missed. Thermal cam caught him pacing near your room before the cellar, gloves on, duffel bag in hand, staging." "Yep." I leaned back. The pieces were falling into place faster than I could process them. Omar pulled up a final file, a classified database pinged from a restricted server. Someone from the inside had searched my real identity. "Recently. They know," he said. "Or they suspect who you really are. Not just Myla, not just Quinn's daughter, government asset." I stared at the screen. The reflection of my own face flickered back at me, not quite aligned. I didn't recognize her, but she looked ready. I pulled the butterfly clip from my pocket again, twirled it between my fingers. A child's object, a weapon, a reminder. "Omar," I said quietly, "let's show them what a ghost looks like when she stops hiding." He grinned. "You read my mind. We had work to do. We needed a witness. A living one." I remembered the audit that never happened, or so they thought. The guy who'd stumbled across Julian's offshore funnel right before he died under mysterious circumstances. Marcus Thorne. Officially dead. Unofficially vanished. He'd been the only one who'd questioned the numbers. The only one with the guts to try to expose them. And the only one who'd been silenced. Until now. Omar traced him quickly through obfuscated records oil company, pension rural medical clinics. One lead showed him in Bend, Oregon. Deep forest country. The kind of place where GPS lost signal. The kind of place perfect for someone hiding from the world. We packed gear, encrypted bags, burner IDs. I wasn't afraid. I was focused. We arrived at dusk. A narrow dirt road, old pine trunk shading our path. No cars, no lights. I stepped from the car and felt the damp earth under my boots. Omar led me to a cabin. Small, rustic, but lived in. Smoke curled from the chimney. We knocked. A lull. Then footsteps. The door creaked open. A man, mid-40s, build lean but steady beard, salt and pepper, eyes sharp-tired, Marcus Thorne, alive. The weight of him hit me like a confession. Paige Blake, he said. Not Ms. Blake, not Myla Quinn. He used the name I'd taken for the CIA, not the name my father gave me. Or, should I say, Agent Blake? No answers. I nodded instead. He stepped aside. Come in. The room smelled of wood smoke and old coffee. File cabinets lined one wall. A map of the P&W was tacked to the opposite side. It was pin-spotted with post-its and push-pins trail safe houses cell signal drops. He motioned to a worn leather chair and sat across a low table. Omar stayed near the door. We didn't offer pleasantries. You weren't supposed to be alive, I said. He let that land. Then produced a recorder, tiny metallic. They expected me to die. Media ran it, obituary, funeral, money shifted. He pressed play. It was my father's voice ordering the hit, make sure the bodies don't talk. I leaned forward. They didn't. He pulled folders from drawer after drawer, recorded interviews with whistleblowers, computer forensic screenshots of spreadsheets Julian signed, line-by-line details of offshore account structures, emails between shell company handles, contracts laced with my father's digital signatures. But one file made me stop. A PDF contract stamped Quinn Defense, confidential with Julian's digital signature, an internal code QDJX17. That was the code I'd seen in the deleted offshore transfer logs. It was his. My hand tightened on the edge of the table. This was it, the smoking gun. He slid another folder across. It contained Julian's fingerprints lifted from a security token and his login logs. Same timestamp as the forged contracts. His name was on the paperwork. His access level authenticated. No hacks, no framing. Julian signed it himself, I whispered. Marcus met my gaze. He always was the golden boy. But, you know better. You were watching. I nodded. The trauma of the farm, of surviving, of reconnecting with my purpose, it crystallized here. This was what survival meant. Not just to stay alive, but to redefine it, to reframe the narrative. Marcus pressed play to another tape Julian in his own voice on a conference call, discussing delivery terms with an arms dealer. The voice matched. He didn't know it was recorded. Not agent quality, just a kid who thought he was untouchable. I ran a hand through my hair. Thank you. The words felt hollow. We need your voice. You need to go public. He shook his head. It's not safe. As long as they think I'm dead. He tapped the recorder. It's a shield for us both. I understood that logic, but I had other plans. I can protect you. We'll expose everything on our schedule. He studied me, then nodded. Let's do it. We spent the night planning. Datelines, press releases, server dumps. Marcus outlined press outlets without vendettas. Omar would handle security. I would get the documents to Anna Sharma in San Francisco. She had the teeth to push it legal and public. Over the next hours, I thought of every person buried under Quinn Defence's reign. The people erased, the ones overlooked, the ones who fought and died in silence. Their voices needed to rise now. Morning came. We walked outside. The cabin door closed behind us. We loaded the car hard drive's files recorder. Omar handed me the recorder. This one's yours. I lifted my chin. I breathed in. The sky opened up. I felt alive, not just existing, but rewriting, not just surviving, but dragging the darkness into the light. I turned to them both. Let's go unbury the truth. The courtroom was packed. Journalists with pens poised cameras lining every wall, and the scent of tension thick in the air. This wasn't just a civil hearing, it felt like a reckoning. That was the point. Anna Sharma Sharp in navy stood beside me. To her right, Marcus and Omar watched quietly. I scanned the room. My father's stone face at the front row, my mother's cold composure. Beside him, Julian slumped and pale. And then, to everyone's surprise, he rose. Not Julian. My father's senior partner, General Robert Caldwell, former military, now board member. He snapped to his feet, lips tightening. The courtroom hushed as he strode toward us. It felt surreal. Anna and I glanced at each other. He came directly to the front, stood rigid before me, then gave me a crisp military salute. Head tilted slightly. Perfect. Protocol. The whisper rolled through the gallery. General speaking? My father's jaw dropped. The judge leaned in. The entire room froze. I swallowed. General Caldwell turned to the judge. Your Honour, I served alongside her father, and I bear witness to the character of this woman. He did not break form. He saluted again, then addressed me, ma'am. It wasn't disrespect. It was respect. For me. For what I'd done. Silence soaked the room. My father's face was an ashen mask. My mother's eyes darted. Julian's stare found the floor. It's time words meant something, Anna said, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. We have 6 volumes of CIA documentation, verifying Agent Blake's undercover role full authorization. We have audio logs demonstrating a coordinated attempt to murder her. We have contracts signed by Mr. Julian Quinn. We have offshore accounts tied to Quinn Defence. And we have witnesses. She paused, all attention on her, all power in her voice. Ladies and gentlemen, I present the evidence. Slide projectors flickered to life. First, a redacted CIA memorandum signed by Caleb Warren, Director of Covert Ops, referencing Agent Blake's placement inside Quinn Defence to identify financial irregularities. Next, the recording of my father taped by Omar's hack, ordering the murder staging. My hand tightened on the bench. The gallery gasped. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father's eyes brimmed with panic, not concern, but calculation. Julian shifted again. Anna nodded to the prosecutor to call witnesses. First came Omar. His calm testimony laid out the digital trail. Then Marcus Thorne took the stand. He recounted how he died, how he'd watched Quinn run bogus disaster narratives, and how he'd hidden until now to stay alive, and now to bring the truth. I feared for my life, Marcus said quietly, but Agent Blake gave me reason. Next, Anna asked me to approach the stand. The judge leaned forward. Agent Blake, a prosecutor's interference, Anna interjected. Still classified, Your Honour? The judge nodded reluctantly. The hush returned. Page Anna said, Describe your emotional trajectory. What happened the night you regained consciousness? I described the butterfly clip, the crawl, the cameras, the messages. I described Omar finding me the files, and my return with Marcus. I spoke calmly, measured with the discipline of the farm. I saw my mother's eyes glisten. Then came the surprise. Anna held up a screen feed. General Caldwell, she asked softly, what is your connection to the defendant? He cleared his throat. I'm her father's oldest friend. I served 50 years between us. But I'm not here to finesse anything. I'm here to tell you I trained this woman to be fierce. I mentored her through her grief when she was erased from her own family. If this had been a career report, I would have said highest caliber. Another gasp. My father's lips trembled. Finally came the confrontation. Anna turned to Julian in the gallery. Miss Blake wishes to address him. Permission, the judge nodded. Julian was called forward. He shuffled, avoiding her eyes. When he reached the stand, I stood. The room hovered. One question, I said quietly. When I was kicked out at 16 when you watched me walk down that driveway. What did you say? Julian looked at me blankly. I don't remember, he said, his voice small. I was shocked. He swallowed. I waited. He shook his head. I didn't say anything. Silence is still a choice. I felt tears not from sadness, but from the resolve solidifying in my chest. Silence can be its own kind of crime. I spoke softly, but with conviction. Silence means you agree. He glanced at our parents and at last looked at me. His shoulders slumped. No words came. Anna closed the laptop. Cameras flashed. Outside, reporters crowded us. Caldwell filed by silent salute. I looked at him. He nodded once and walked away. My mother burst through the doors behind us, flanked by lawyers, pale and furious. My father's coat was on crooked. I stepped forward, head high. These are the people who buried me. No more. The cameras caught it. I saw my brother there, small in a crowd that had once sung his praises. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I said, voice steady. I'm demanding accountability. Anna slipped her arm around mine. Court finds merit in the evidence. Investigation ordered. Bail set at 0. All defendants barred from contacting the plaintiff. The judge's gavel banged like a victory marker. But the real win wasn't the ruling. It was the recognition, not just of guilt, but of presence. In that moment, I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was visible. Justice may take time, but truth had its day. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within hours, the media carried the verdict far beyond the courtroom walls. Julian, once the family's golden boy, unravelled. His initial bravado cracked as live footage caught him pacing behind attorneys, his name trending, his image tarnished. He appeared before cameras, his defence team reading a statement. I regret my actions and welcome the inquiry, his voice quivering not the charming tone everyone once applauded. By midday, Julian's carefully constructed persona, the confident rising star, was collapsing. His voice recordings, once smug and polished during shady conference calls, now haunted network news segments. Audio analysis from the trial revealed the hired step-down path, the staged timestamps, the man behind his legacy. The more Julian tried to clarify, the more his words became evidence of guilt. He stopped granting interviews. Behind the scenes, his world crumbled. His phone stopped ringing. A planned speaking engagement at a tech summit was cancelled. His peers at the company exchanged worried glances. At home, he was trapped. Bail conditions included an ankle monitor and a court order, banning him from leaving the state. By evening, the Quinn defence stock had plummeted. Shareholders panicked. The board convened emergency meetings. Rumours spread of collapsing contracts and penalties from the Pentagon. Late-night financial channels speculated on whether the company could survive the scandal. It was then I heard about my father's stroke. The news came via Lena, the family's longtime house manager and confidant. She called from the hospital, voice low. I listened. The proud titan who once looked down on me now lay incapacitated in ICU, his right side paralysed. The irony was hard to stomach. The man who tried to bury me was buried by his own collapse, bodily and reputational. Mama had been placed under house arrest. The judge saw her as a flight risk and a danger to the investigation. No more cosmopolitan dinners or public speaking engagements. She was watched legally. Gone were her perfect coiffure and couture suits. Now she was confined to a monitored residence overseen by federal agents around the clock. That same evening, I drove past the Quinn estate on my way to a secure CIA safe house. It sat under floodlights chairs on the porch, police tape on the lawn, a silent echo of glamour lost. I slowed my car window open. The wind from the hedges carried nothing of what once was. I swallowed. The next morning, I called my mother's attorney and arranged a final visit. She was gaunt, tense, her voice stiff. I extended the courtesy but meant no reconciliation. We sat across a polished wood table in the family's law office. She said nothing at first. Finally, Paige or Mila, she said, trying to name me the new one. You've destroyed us. I let that settle, then leaned forward. I didn't destroy anyone. You did, I paused. I'm not here to forgive. I'm here to close the chapter. She stared, lip trembling. I said, we're done. She looked away. A woman who had never known limits now faced a quiet dismissal. There were no tears, just the finality of truth. Meanwhile, an envelope arrived in my CIA inbox, encrypted, silently delivered. The sender was Julian. Subject line: You always thought you were held higher. Inside his email, Mila, you think you're better than us, that you can walk away clean, but you still don't see any of us. Julian. I didn't reply. I forwarded the email to my handler with one sentence attached: he still doesn't understand. Then I deleted the email permanently. By late afternoon, Quinn Defense had a new board announcement. A federal investigation was underway. All contracts were paused pending review. Pentagon flagged audits. International partners withdrew. Within 2 hours, the stock had dropped another 15%. Inside the safe house, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Quiet, unsmiling pride. Not victory. Just completion. Then I turned to Omar and Marcus, who'd flown in to help facilitate next steps. Their presence reassured me. We're done here, Omar asked. For now, I said. There are still hearing subpoenas. But the structure is gone. The illusion is broken. Marcus nodded. You did what you came to do. I stared at the forest beyond the reinforced window. Ashes left the ground fragile, but something stronger remained. That night, at the safe house desk, I opened my email draft to CIA headquarters. Subject field report, mission complete. I typed objective achieved, primary target destabilized, exfiltration of key assets successful. Secondary target, Julian Quinn, is contained. However, additional monitoring recommended. Quinn Defense has entered regulatory suspension. Recommend continued oversight. Over and out, Agent Miller. I paused before sending. I didn't send the email immediately. I left the safe house, walked into the wooded yard. I stood under stars. Cold air brushed against my face. I inhaled the clean scent of pine. The phone buzzed a notification. Mission complete, field team acknowledged. But the night was empty. I closed my eyes. Thought of the girl I was at 16, the broken daughter no one defended. Thought of the woman in the courtroom who finally found her voice. Thought of the mother who taught me that silence can kill. Thought of Julian still stuck in the same frame. And for the first time, I didn't feel hollow, just present. I quit the CIA quietly. It wasn't dramatic. No letters of commendation, no fanfare. Just a phone call to Luca, my handler in a diner in Virginia. He slid a sealed envelope across the table. New identity, new life, he said. No goodbye, no eye contact, just the weight of those words. I folded the envelope and placed it in my bag. It felt heavy final. Maine in winter was shockingly beautiful. The cabin was small, 2 rooms and a wood stove, but the lake beyond was grand, frozen and pristine. Snowflakes fell in thick silence like the quiet I'd chased my whole life. The first morning, I woke to a world coated in white. I walked outside, leaving footprints that disappeared as soon as I made them. A metaphor, I thought. For a moment, I didn't mind vanishing. Inside, I found a letter from Luca. Sometimes the mission is living. Use it. I unpacked sparse groceries but couldn't sleep. Instead, I chopped wood, lit the stove, boiled water for tea. The steam curled like a promise. A week later, I found Gable in a shelter, an old golden retriever with sad eyes and a crooked tail. I named him after Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper from my childhood villa, the one person who had shown me kindness. The dog leaned into my hand the moment I looked at him. I filled out paperwork, signed my new name. Gable's tail thumped against the hardwood floor as I carried him through the front door. He hopped onto the sofa and looked out at the lake. I sat beside him, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at home. Days passed in ordinary miracles. I learned how to bake sourdough, fell flat-faced on my first try, but I kept going. I sowed lettuce, kale, and root vegetables. I pruned a rose bush. I capitalized on the rhythm of seasons. I trimmed firewood. I washed laundry and hung it outside, watching the sun's warmth fade through the snow. I found peace in repetition. A neighbour, Mrs. Callahan, started visiting. She lived alone in a yellow cottage 2 lots away. She had Alzheimer's and often forgot where she was. I helped her set the table, offered tea, listened as she told stories about Maine in summers past. Sometimes she'd cry, sometimes she'd laugh about a man long gone. Once she held my hand and whispered, "You remind me of someone I loved." I let the seconds stretch. No mission, no interrogation, just presence. Gable would curl up next to her and lick her hand. She smiled, eyes bright for that moment. She didn't need to know that the dog was named after a ghost. She just needed the warmth of touch. I started volunteering at a community garden. I planted seedlings with local families, hands muddy laughter, easy no secrets. One afternoon, a girl asked why I wore gloves so thick. "I just like gardening," I said, and let it be. In evenings, I drew. Not robots or blueprints, but landscapes, the frozen lake, the pine trees, the back of Gable's head as he watched the fire. My hands moved slow. My chest felt less tight. I tracked the moon phases and learned to ice fish patience embodied. I sat on a bucket rod in hand waiting. The hole in the ice looked like a portal. Once I felt a tug set the hook reeled in a small trout. I released it. I didn't need to catch life, just to feel it. A year passed, my hair grew longer. I wore flannel and boots. I kept my identity quiet, Mia Reynolds now. Occasional emails to Luca. "I'm alive." "It's enough," he replied with a smiley. One winter night, I received an encrypted message from CIA headquarters, ready for next mission. I stared at the screen. The question was full of potential, but I didn't touch the keys. I shut the laptop and walked outside. Gable bounded after me. I stood at the lake's edge. Stars reflected on the ice. Snow drifted. I looked down at Gable's face, illuminated by moonlight, and smiled. He shifted, sniffed the air. No mission, just living. Some mornings I still wake up, feeling that familiar shake in my chest, the one I remember from when I was 16 and hollowed out inside. For a moment, I'll think I'm somewhere else, and panic will whisper, "They're coming. They know." But Gable's warm body curled against my side reminds me who I am now. That I'm safe. That I exist. The memories don't disappear. The girl standing alone on that driveway, the echo of the front gate slamming shut, the whisper of my mother's voice telling me I didn't belong. All of it is folded into me, but none of it controls me anymore. I carry the past, yes, but not its weight. I feel it in my chest, not around my neck. Sometimes I drive into town to pick up provisions. They know me as Mia, the quiet woman with the dog and the snowy cabin. My name is no longer a trap. No one mistakes it for privilege or scandal. Just a neighbour who smiles at the frost on their windows and asks if they need help with firewood. Most nights I sit by the stove, Gable at my feet, and watch the snow blanket everything. The trees, the road, the distant lights of the neighbour's house shimmer. I place my hand over my heart, the cadence slow and sure. I think I am here, not hidden, not erased. Last week I baked a pie for Mrs. Callahan's birthday. She tried to feed it to Gable first, then insisted I taste it. Her hair was wispy, eyes distant, but she clasped my hands and said, "You remind me of someone I loved." And I let the seconds stretch, letting connection fill the spaces that once ached. There are evenings when lessons from the farm slip through, but I don't need them anymore. The discipline turns to stillness. The rules I follow now are ones I chose: wake, breathe, chop wood, feed Gable, sift earth, breathe again. I found a journal in a second-hand store. I started writing in it yesterday. Not spy code, just days. Snowfall. How Gable chased reflections on the pond. Sometimes I draw the lake, sometimes I just write the words, waiting is enough, and know they mean everything. A few days ago, an email appeared on the encrypted laptop I still keep hidden in my drawer. Subject ready for the next mission. I stared at it. It was a question that once ruled my life. I held my breath. The cursor blinked under my new name, offering me passage back into shadows I'd escaped. I closed the laptop gently, not sent, not deleted. Just closed. Then I went outside, and Gable followed, tail wagging faintly. I brushed tracks in the snow, our prints together, one paw, one boot. One life, one dog. Under the vast northern sky, I raised my hand to my chest. The snow fell slow as memory. I whispered to it, I'm here. I'm alive. Under the vast northern sky, I raised my hand to my chest. The snow fell slow as memory. I whispered to it, I'm here. I'm alive. Some mornings, I still wake up feeling like that 16-year-old girl discarded unheard too much or never enough. And maybe I always will. But now, I don't try to erase her. I just sit with her. Let her be quiet beside me and remind her we made it. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own home, like love was conditional and silence was survival, you're not alone. There are so many of us who grew up learning how to make ourselves smaller, to not upset the balance, to protect the people who hurt us just so we could stay close to something that looked like love. But here's what I've learned. Your voice is not a weapon. It's a return ticket to yourself. Maybe you're not ready to walk away. Maybe you've walked, but your chest still aches when you pass an old photo. That's okay. Healing doesn't come in bold leaps. It shows up quietly in cooking your own breakfast, in petting a dog, in saying no without explaining. And if you need permission to start over, this is it. You don't have to become anyone else. You don't need to prove anything to the people who refuse to see you. Your life gets to be yours now. Write down what hurt. Burn it. Plant something. Take long walks. Speak gently to yourself when your mind isn't. Find people who don't need you to shrink. And when the past knocks, look at it, thank it for teaching you, then close the door. If this story moved you, if you saw a part of yourself in Mila, know that this space is for you too. I hope her voice helped you find a little more of yours. And if you'd like to stay close to stories that remind you you're not alone, hit that subscribe button. We've got more to share, more to feel, and more to heal together. You're not invisible, you're not too late, you're exactly where your healing begins.